From ELCA Advocacy, this is Here I Pod. There's so much happening in our communities every week and every day that are impacted by policies at the local, state, and federal levels. Here I Pod will focus on one aspect of what's happening each episode by talking with faith-based advocates, as well as providing steps that you can take in your own advocacy efforts. In episode 8, our host Regina Banks speaks to a panel consisting of Vance Blackfox, Justice Nichols, and Brenda Blackhawk. You'll hear their full titles as Regina introduces them. In this extended conversation, they discuss the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women, which you will hear referred to as MMIW. MMIW Awareness Day was held just this week on May 5th. They also discuss other topics, such as the relationship that Indigenous peoples and tribal nations have with the federal government, and what others can learn from them in this moment in particular. While this conversation does cover difficult topics, such as domestic violence, they are discussed with thoughtfulness and care. After the panel, you'll hear a history segment from Joey Chen, and I'll be back to close things out and tell you where you can learn more about the breadth of work done by the Indigenous Ministries and tribal relations of the ELCA. Here's Regina to get us started.
Today on Here I Pod, we have three colleagues that are with us. Vance Blackfox, Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations for the ELCA. Justice Nichols, Program Coordinator for Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations of the ELCA. And Brenda Blackhawk is the Director of Communications at Central Lutheran Church in Minneapolis. And our colleagues are here to have a conversation with us about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And perhaps I'll start with you, Vance, because in previous conversations that I've had with colleagues, the framework has been the new administrations in Washington, D.C., both the new Trump administration and the new Congress, and the flurry of executive orders and the budget process that is ongoing as we speak here on April 29th. Is that the appropriate frame for us to look at the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women?
That's a good question. And thank you, Regina, for having us. I'm excited to be able to share more about MMIW. But I think this question is important as well, to think about how we move forward as Indigenous peoples, as people who are citizens of tribal nations across this country in particular. But I think it's important for folks to understand that this administration, while it's challenging for many, or maybe even most, in regard to all the changes that are being made, that for us, it's not so scary, maybe, as it might be for other folks. And I don't want to speak for every Native person in the country, but for many of us who do this work day to day, it's not as scary, it's familiar. Because though this administration is moving quickly in ways that we may not appreciate, we have had to deal with these challenges that are very similar or not, or if not the same, over and over and over throughout the years, throughout the generations under other administrations that might have been a little more friendly even. And so for us, for me, I should say, this hasn't been as scary because it's what we've already known to be true and challenging for Native people, for tribal nations, and so on. So again, don't want to speak for all Native people, but I think for many of us, it's something that we're ready to handle. So for those who are not Native, it might feel a little scary. It might feel frustrating. It might feel overwhelming because it feels new, because your freedoms or privileges might be being attacked or might be being influenced in some way or changed or threatened. But for us and the people that we serve and care for in our communities, it doesn't necessarily feel the same. Now, there might be challenges for our tribal nations who want to keep intact the services or the funding or the priorities in place that the federal government is responsible for adhering to through their trust and treaty responsibilities to tribal nations. So a lot of extra work, maybe, or returning to the extra work we used to have to do because of the changes that this administration is making in regards to trust and treaty responsibilities, or threatening to, because they're supposed to just do it, right? That's what a trust and treaty responsibility is. They're beholden to it. It's legal, and so while there's a lot of extra work, it's not maybe as scary as for that.
And for some of our listeners, this might be the first time that they have heard about the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women. How would you explain what that is, what that means, and how long you've been working on this issue?
Yeah, well, some of us have been working on this issue for a very long time. And for me, it hits relatively close to home. I have family who has gone missing, distant cousin, but certainly close in relationship to her aunts and uncles. And so, and other family members, she went missing 6 years ago, and I had the responsibility of helping to open up that story for the family because no one was taking responsibility for the investigation or even responding to her having gone missing. And so I did some work to make sure that the story was put out by the press in ways that helped to move that along. And so I'm grateful to have been able to do that. And her remains were found just a couple months ago. So, so a lot of things going on in the family right now and in the community as we get ready to celebrate her life, but certainly mourn and grieve her in a new and different way. And so for me, it's personal, but for most of us, in any country, it's personal, whether it be someone that has gone missing in our family or someone we knew or someone who knew somebody or whose family member went missing. And so important for us to recognize that this isn't something that's out there for us. It's immediate, it's central. And so we're impacted. As we hear more and more people, I mean, just on Facebook this morning, I had 3 more notices: so-and-so's missing, so-and-so's missing, so-and-so's missing. If you see so-and-so, you contact the tribal police or contact the county sheriff. And so I think it's important for folks to know that this issue of missing Indigenous people, women in particular, girls in particular, Two-Spirit people in particular, is key to understanding that they too are impacted, right?
And thank you, Vance, for sharing your personal connection to the work that you do. We really appreciate the work that you do and also being willing to share so much of yourself in it. But yes, Brenda, what brings you to this work, and can you tell us a little more about what it is that you do?
Yeah, so I'm currently one of the co-chairs with Justice for the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Subtask Force. I always just think that it's really important to name that we say MMIW mostly because we really want to honor the work that's been done around this already by Indigenous women over generations now. But when we say MMIW, we really are talking about our missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. A lot of times you might even see MMIR, MMIP for people, just because we're disproportionately affected in this way where we're either going missing or murdered, whether we are Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit, as Vance said, or even boys and men and elders. Like disproportionately, our demographic is more likely for it to occur that we're going missing or murdered. And yeah, we've been doing a lot of great work. Justice and I have just been chairs for, I think it's still under a year, isn't it, Justice? And yeah, so we've been kind of regrouping and starting to really dive into some of this work, which we're really excited to share today.
Justice, what brings you into this work?
Well, I definitely being Native American, being a woman, I have just a big sense of the nervousness when it comes to this crisis. I think that I don't want to say fear, but I get very nervous when it comes to traveling and stuff like that with, and I think of all the relatives that we've had that have gone missing. And like Vance gave me the opportunity to work with Brenda. And then we got on this task force together. And I think that's like what really held me in here and being like, okay, like I'm staying on top of things. I'm able to do things and I'm going to make real change when it comes to things. And especially like some of the goals that me and Brenda have set for our subtask force is to try to get churches more involved in helping this crisis, whether it's in rural or city areas and stuff. So I think that's one of the big reasons why I come out here is because I want to help others. And I would hope that one day if anything happened that there would be others out there helping me.
And Justice, this is a subtask force of which committee?
Missing and murdered Indigenous women.
So one of the things that we have committed ourselves to is repudiating the doctrine of discovery in the ELCA, as you know, Regina. And so Bishop Eaton commissioned a repudiation of the doctrine of discovery task force a few years ago, 3 years ago, I guess it is now. And so this, at the encouragement of one of our chairs, I shouldn't say one, but of our chairs, Manuel Ritamosa and former Bishop Jessica Christ, we now have this subtask force of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And so while Jessica is a part of that conversation, we felt it was important that we had some strong Indigenous women. And as you hear here, we have two incredibly strong Indigenous women to lead us in that process in the ELCA through that subtask force to the repudiation task force.
Fantastic. Justice, I know that you're a very busy woman. I know that you're also involved in climate justice and climate work. So I wanted to pivot just a little bit and see can you talk a little bit about how missing murdered Indigenous women crisis intersects with issues of maybe land sovereignty and extractive energies? What is this administration doing to help or hinder that intersectional work that you might be working on?
Yeah, so I was able to work with our DC colleagues and had the opportunity to go and just get all their knowledge when it comes to, policy and stuff like that. And so for me, I think I'm able to put my knowledge into the subtask force to kind of think about different areas. So like the three areas that I talk about mostly when it comes to like the intersections is like the displacements and the vulnerability when it comes to like disasters, like especially in rural areas or coastal areas, so that like they're susceptible to like natural disasters and rising sea levels and stuff like that. It gives them a higher risk for violence and like trafficking. And then the second one is exploitation of resources, like large scale like projects like oil mining and pipelining and all of that influxes a lot of different strangers onto reservations, and the influx of those strangers is higher. Like there's higher data of women and boys and relatives going missing. The second one would be exploitation of resources, the large scale industrial projects for it. It's heightening human trafficking more. And Brenda talked a little bit more about this, about man camps is what they call it, the influx of strangers coming in. And then there's the fight between tribal and state when prosecuting these people. And since they are only there for maybe a couple months at a time, it's really hard to track them down after that. So I think that's where that crisis comes in there with the pipelining and stuff like that. And then the failure to address the climate change is worsening these structural issues. And so it's forcing women to migrate or stay into situations that cause more domestic violence that ends up with more missing and murdered crisis like that.
Where are the missing and murdered Indigenous women going? Is this a question of domestic violence? Are these strangers that are coming in from outside of the community and harming these women? What is the nature of these disappearances? What is the nature of these disappearances?
Can I answer that? So one of my favorite quotes when we're talking about MMIW comes from the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center. And if it's okay, I'd love to read that because I think it really just expresses the deep historical roots of why MMIW happens. So they say that the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women is not new. It is more than an epidemic. Instead, it is part of the spectrum of violence experienced by Native women. This crisis of MMIW has deep roots in colonization and genocide and can be attributed to the lack of legal protections as a result of the systemic erosion of tribal sovereignty stretching back more than 500 years. When we talk about MMIW, a lot of times people will refer to like Pocahontas, right, being the first MMIW as like a 12-year-old girl who was taken away to wherever. But like that's kind of what we're talking about. The historical roots of this is really deeply embedded in that. And you ask the question of where are these missing women going and what's happening? And it's a spectrum of things, but I think it's really important to know some of the statistics around that. The first thing to know is that more than 4 out of 5 Indigenous women have experienced violence in their lifetime. So some of that being domestic violence, that's true. When we talk about specifically like sexual violence and domestic violence, when we talk about it in regards to race, most of the time those kinds of things happen within race, right? So
Sure.
You're more likely to be a white woman raped by a white man, that kind of thing, right? And for Indigenous women, that's actually not the case. We're more likely to experience that violence at the hands of somebody outside of our racial group. And there's a lot of reasons behind that, right? Some of it's the fetishization of Indigenous women, but a lot of it has to do with the legal systems and how, especially on like reservations in places where we have some tribal sovereignty, we don't have the legal precedents and the ability to actually prosecute people who aren't Indigenous in those spaces, and so people can get away with it. And then, as Justice was saying, trafficking is another big, huge piece of that. I think there's a statistic that something like 40% of victims of sex trafficking are identified as Indigenous women. And that doesn't necessarily mean Indigenous solely like Indigenous Americans, but it could be Indigenous, in other places. But like, in just that we're at such a high risk to be trafficked.
It sounds like this might be the most hidden intersectional issue that we work on, because it sounds like that hit every other justice that the church works on, criminal justice and racial disparities and all of it. Thank you for sharing that. Vance, coming back to you, I heard a bit about this issue right around the time that Killers of the Flower Moon came out. It was on for about a week. I would hear something in the news about missing and murdered Indigenous women, and then it was gone. Can you share a little bit about what media's reaction to this movement is and how it does or does not play into the work that you do?
Thank you. The goal, one of the goals, if not the primary goal of, let's say, the doctrine of discovery, or even the philosophy of manifest destiny, or even the ideology of, say, democracy and the colonial project in general, their goal is to erase us. So erasure of Indigenous peoples has been the goal in every instance, whether it be killing us, disappearing us, or eliminating our identity through things like adoption into white families, which happens for generations, or Indian boarding schools. And so erasure is key to this conversation as well, because then it starts to make sense as to why you would only see the media cover anything about MMIW when prompted by a major Hollywood film. So when it's niche, or when it's timely, or when it's something that's going to get some interest or peaks or hits on their social media or viewership on their newscast, then it becomes something valuable to them. Because we are what many people consider statistically insignificant. And that is the case. We're seen that way in, say, philanthropy. We're seen that way in academia. We're seen that way in government and government subsidies and ways in which we support Indigenous peoples, both at all levels. And we're seen that way, quite honestly, in the church. And not just the ELCA, but church and all the communities. So the importance of covering a story about Indigenous peoples, or centering Indigenous challenges or issues or injustice or genocide, is not sexy. It's not important because it doesn't impact the privilege. And so you really have to be committed to social justice. You really have to be committed to justice generally in order for one to really engage in the work necessary to rectify how you, as an individual who's not Indigenous, might be indeed complicit and certainly implicated. And so the press doesn't need to talk about us because no one's interested in hearing about us. And like I said, unless it's something that is special or unique or a one-off,
Sexy.
never a constant. And so for then us, I would even include this team here, me, Justice, Brenda, and others who work in this church in a variety of ways on the task force and in other places, understand that. And so we commit ourselves to a church that we work really hard to love at times, and a church that has oftentimes given some good things to some of us, but also a church that challenges us and continues to challenge us because it promotes in its privilege the erasure and or the forgetfulness. The convenient forgetfulness becomes something that is centered instead of centering Indigenous peoples and remembering who we are and why we're important. So that has inspired them the work. So it's not just me interested in how do we really have the media do something more, something different. They're going to do what they're going to do. For us in the church now, the work is how do we get the church? How do we get our 3 million plus members to know anything about Indigenous peoples, but certainly know something about MMIW, know something about what's happening down the street from where they live. Our saint, the Reverend Marlene White Rabbit Helgamo, who was a leader in this church, the first Native woman to be ordained a Lutheran pastor, was someone who always said, with it, there's a reservation and or Native community within 100 miles of every Lutheran congregation in the United States.
Is that real? Is that true?
Yes. And so how how is it that the people in our congregations know so little about us? The goal is to help our people heal, help the church heal. And part of that healing means that they have to hear the truth, and then they have to do something about that truth. Otherwise, they're just continually to be a perpetrator of the injustice that Indigenous peoples are experiencing at the hands of systems of the church, like the church, I should say, the government at all levels, and even individuals who make certain decisions that are resource related and or people related and or priority related in regard to the work that is in front of them. Yeah, it's important for us to think about that. I think about boarding schools, which were run by missionaries, both Lutheran and non-Lutheran, not more that were not Lutheran, but missionaries that were out in the field who were not always on the up and up. And how many of our Native children, Native girls, Native boys went missing at the hands of Christians and or missionaries, pastors, of priests, of nuns who were sexually assaulted and were disappeared in a variety of ways. That's a real thing. That really happened. And because
That long ago.
not that long ago, indeed. And so it's important, I think, for us to remember that the church has a lot of work to do to heal, not just heal the system, but as individual parishioners, as individual congregants, as individual members of our church and all the other denominations in the Catholic Church, we have to do the work. Because part of the healing is the work that is then challenged, that we're challenged by when we know the truth. But so many people don't know the truth, right? So we've got to do the work of telling the truth. And so part of the way in which we do that then is through the Truth and Healing movement that was also commissioned by presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton. Over the last 3 years, we've been providing opportunities for learning about all things Indigenous at various levels. And so this May, we have some things coming up in regard to learning about Indigenous peoples. We're encouraging folks to be a part of some of that work. You can find that information, if I can do the little plug now.
Absolutely. Just anticipating my very next question.
All right, but just want to get this in here because it's important. Brenda and Justice and myself and others, Kelly and Dr. Kelly Sherman Conroy, I keep saying Kelly like everybody knows her, but most people do, but have created resources around MMIW. And so you can go and find that information right away at elca.org/MMI. And so it takes you straight to that particular webpage with all the resources that these incredible women have created. But you also then can go to elca.org/truth and healing and see the activities that we have planned for May. There are two, while we're encouraging folks to participate on May 5th for Red Shirt Day, basically. One way of calling it would be, but it's the National Day of Awareness for Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women. And so people are encouraged to wear red on that day, but we're also encouraging folks to have an MMIW Sunday at their congregation to lift up this information and or host a candlelight prayer vigil that was authored by Dr. Kelly Sherman Conroy. And then we have two presentations. One is on May 13th, which will be by Justice and Brenda. And I might be there too, but we're also going to invite other partners into the room to have conversation with us and to share kind of what the subtask force is doing. And so that's exciting. And how we're looking not just for this May, but into the future and how we can establish some roots, some rootedness in doing this important work in the church. And then on May 22nd, I mentioned earlier that my cousins, Pam Fencer and Emily Thompson, mother and daughter, had been a part of searching for their niece and cousin, Aubrey Dameron, who'd gone missing 6 years ago. So they'll be joining us to share their story and their journey and how they've engaged in the work in deeper ways because of Aubrey's having gone missing and likely murdered. So we're looking forward to having that conversation and having people hear that real life story of MMIW.
Thank you. Thank you for giving people who are new to this issue an entry point. So all of those dates are opportunities for people to get involved. I'm going to ask this of all three of you, and I promise it'll be a downer, but then we can talk. We can go up. In your ministry, how do you hold space for grief and rage and resistance to the issue of MMIW and maybe Indigenous issues in general? And how can the wider church accompany you in the sacred work?
I'm just taking that question in right now. That's a very big question.
Just the question alone makes me want to cry. Everyone has an issue. Everyone has a challenge. Everyone has something that they champion. But when you live amongst your people, when you work with and amongst your people, day to day, as Indigenous people, the issues and challenges that we face are not something that we can ignore. In the faces of the people that we care about, that we care for, people that we work with and work for, we see and know that they're experiencing a variety of things that other folks don't have to experience. But the injustice and the genocide that has built a certainly resilient, and sometimes I don't like using that word, but a resilient people, a resilient person, many times, are often the people up front that you see doing the work, being the advocate, working in policy, creating program, doing some education. But for every one of us, there are countless others who don't have the same privilege to do this, that need us, that hope for us to do better by the next generation. And the generation after that, the generation after that, and the generation after that. And so that there are people who are pained because of MMIW, who have generations of coping in ways that are not healthy, around addiction, around abuse that we've inherited, that make doing the work not just something that gets me a paycheck, but instead makes me know that the work likely will never end, but that mountaintop will never be realized for us in this generation necessarily, but is necessarily the most important thing because we can see it even in the paces of the strong. That our empathy, that our compassion to seek justice for our siblings that are Indigenous is not just for the sake of accomplishing something, but because we know it impacts and will impact prayerfully the people around us and people that we don't even know. It's just so hard because when I do Indigenous ministry work and I do tribal relations work, the work is so much deeper than just planting a church. The work is so much deeper than just making sure that we have new and fresh leaders who will take on all the hard work that it is to be in the church sometimes. It's so much more than just creating a really cool web page that has a lot of good information on it. We know that every little thing that we do is important and will hopefully impact not just Indigenous peoples, but the non-Native people, the non-Indigenous peoples who could potentially also make a difference. So for me, the work is deep and the work is never ending. It is a lifelong commitment. It is a call beyond a call, and it's heartbreaking almost every single day. And oftentimes, not because of what we're experiencing as Indigenous peoples, but because so many people don't care and don't have to.
Justice, did you think of something that you wanted to say?
Yeah. Just like maybe highlighting more of the how I handle the grief and stuff like that is I've like before I came into this work and working with Vance and Brenda and stuff, I think one is Vance has really helped me understand that grief and understand how that historical trauma has been. But he's also given me that light to see that you have to be more strategic in this world. Like it's not back in the day when like we could say things, we could have conversations. You got to be very strategic when it comes to how you feel and how things come out and how you're going to go about certain things and how we do this and how we do this work to get this crisis heard and how we get churches involved, I think is really like a big impact. And I think that having friends and colleagues like you guys, like Regina, Karen, Joey, Blake, all the people that have been here, and like even all the people that I've met that are giving a platform like this for us to talk is very, very great. Like, I'm very grateful for having the opportunity to talk about these things and have these people be so like wanting to know more about this. I think it's very awesome. So a little bit of an up on that.
Brenda, please.
It's a very complex question because I think grief is collective and individual, right? So individually, maybe we handle it differently. I tend to be a creative problem solver. So if I'm feeling down or angry, ready to rage, trying to find a way to do that. But I think collectively, some of the most important things that we've done, and I say Vance specifically because he's the orchestrator of so much of all of it. But one of the beautiful things that Vance has done is created some connections. I wasn't super involved in any of the Indigenous ministry work, but I've been a Lutheran my entire life. And Vance pulled me into it. I met so many other Indigenous Lutherans. I didn't even know any other Indigenous Lutherans hardly until being able to connect with each other and creating that space, and specifically a community of Indigenous Lutherans, has been healing in so many ways, right? I mean, we can vent to each other about our frustrations with the church, but we can also, like Justice was saying, be strategic and find ways to make impact that help not only us, but all of our beloved siblings across the church. So I'm just really grateful for Vance and the opportunities that he's provided for all of us and helping us build these connections in this network.
Thank you. This is a policy podcast, so I'm going to ask one policy question and then I'm going to ask you where you've seen the gospel. But the policy question is this: what is your ask of this administration? What is your ask of this Congress? Is there any particular thing that you can walk into an office and say, vote this way and this will move the needle, laying to the side whether it would actually be done, what could be done?
You know, there's lots of opportunity in that, but I'll be really, really honest. Since November, I have not asked myself that question and thought about that question because it feels unrealistic, and I don't like to hope where there's not.
That's real.
That's not to say that I wouldn't call or write or advocate or whatever. I absolutely would, but I feel like I kind of have just been in internal mode and trying to, within my community and Indigenous Lutherans and all that, and really focusing on those pieces. I do know that there is I think it's a truth and healing like bill or something like that. So I've been following that a little bit, and that would be a great and important thing as far as truth telling for our stories, specifically about Indian boarding schools and the generational trauma and impact that has had on Indigenous communities. And I think that that's really important for us. But in the face of all the many things that are being cut, people need food now. I mean, you know what I mean? And I know that that's one of the biggest things impacting Indigenous communities is like cutting of like government funding to things like food assistance and stuff like that, right? And I think that that's across the board for people, but like we're deeply affected by those things. And I think there's a historical traumatic piece to a lot of that too, right? Is that we have treaties and they're supposed to feed us, and that's all just being thrown out the window again, as it has been many, many times, as Vance said. Like, it's not new for us. We will make it through. We do. But yeah, sorry, that was kind of me rambling a little bit, but
No, that was very succinct. We appreciate that historical referencing.
I don't have any specific ask like a certain policy or anything like that. But I meant when it comes to MMIW, there's just several different areas that I can already think of that could be highlighted, like the jurisdictional reform, like more funding for law enforcement services, like data collection and reporting. I mean, there's just different areas like that. I think that could have so much more eyes on it and, funding wise, awareness wise when it comes to it. But yeah, no specific like policy action that I know of that's out there besides like the Truth and Healing bill that could really, make some awareness and get stories out there and get some of our voices heard in that sense.
And I would just concur with both what Brenda and Justice have said. The Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding Schools Policy Act is the official name of the bill, but Truth and Healing Bill is, let's use that language because it's shorter and let's get it passed if that's what it takes, right? And so there's some momentum there on the Senate side in particular. House side has been slower and throughout this whole movement to have this act passed. But it also, it's getting the stories out there, and some of those stories, again, as I mentioned earlier, around Indian boarding schools, is missing and murdered Indigenous women or relatives. And so this bill would be tremendous to, I think, also lifting up the MMIW. We're grateful that we have stronger jurisdictional support in VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, that first happened in 2013. It was the first time we had actual jurisdictional privilege and permission legally to, people don't know that until before 2013, tribal police, tribal law enforcement could not detain, arrest, bother anybody who was not Indigenous or Native on reservation land. 2013. That was strengthened even further in 2023. In both cases, though, it's just when it comes to, I mean, it sounds awful, but it's a good thing. But still, it's only when violent acts are committed, violent crimes are committed. So don't come and try to steal my car, is a joke I always say, right? And so don't do it. So that strengthening that the jurisdictional stuff and ensuring, as Justice said, that the funding is in place for tribes to continue to police and care for their people, because as Brenda mentioned earlier, it's more likely for Indigenous peoples to experience violence or death or murder at the hands of non-Indigenous people, mostly men. In fact, 96% of the time, both the violence and or murder is at the hands of non-native, usually white men. 96% of the time. So policy that then supports the caring for our people, and making sure that funding is in place. So truth and healing, living up to your responsibility and your treaty and trust responsibilities to tribal nations, it's key. So if you want to talk to your legislators about anything, those are the two things.
Thank you all so much for taking your time to be with us this morning, still morning here in California. The final question I like to ask the guests are, where have you seen the gospel recently? In the work that you do, in all that you have shared, where have you seen the gospel?
So my family, I'm the oldest of 9 siblings. The youngest of my siblings is 9. I've got several who are like teenagers and younger. They're all Indigenous as well. And this last weekend was the area school district that they all go to. That was their powwow, and where they honored the graduating seniors, of which one of them was my sister this year. And she's a unique young woman who came to live with my family when she was 15 months old, and she has fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. So her very young mother, who was also abused and was only 15 when she gave birth to Mel, was using alcohol while she was pregnant, and so Melania has a lot of developmental issues. And it was such a beautiful, beautiful moment, and she was so happy that she had made it at 18 to be able to graduate and to be honored in that way, in that ceremony in front of, all the people in the school district. And it was just very special. So that would be where I saw the gospel this weekend, I think.
Amen. Justice?
You got one, Vance?
Vance, where have you seen the gospel?
Have I seen the gospel? As someone who's worked in the church for a very long time, and someone who likes to think they're a theologian, I think that one of the places that I feel like I've seen the gospel lately is two places, if I might. One is, and it's a couple months ago, but in our classroom setting for theological education for Indigenous leaders. And it's a new program. It's our first cohort. For those of you who are listening, it's kind of like teen program, theological education for emerging ministries, but it's for Indigenous students. Eventually, hopefully, for those pastors or folks who want to be pastors who are non-native in Native communities. But for now, it's Native students. There are 10 altogether. A couple take a break. We missed them. But in that time together, one of the things where I see the gospel is us talking about theological ethics. And Brenda got to be a part of the Wisdom Keepers, the instructors, our little team that was teaching on ethics. And so we went through all the ethics. And in the midst of us having to talk about social ethics and the ways in which, like we talked about here today, have been victims of genocide or have been challenged by the colonial project in ways that other maybe folks in the world or in this country have been affected, we still laugh. we still make sure that we are including folks and caring for folks and those students who are being prepared to be pastors and or deacons and or people who are just more fully equipped leaders in their communities are laughing and caring and praying over one another and singing songs and smudging together. And so when we're in those spaces, whether it be at Teal or at our Indigenous leaders gatherings or in other places where we're gathered together to do this work, and when we get to laugh together and when we get to smudge together and pray and sing together, the gospel is happening. Because I can just imagine, right, that Jesus is there laughing with us and celebrating the the grace that we are giving to the rest of the world, and the church included in that laughter. And then secondly, I would say that I've seen the gospel more recently um, in the work that folks are doing in regard to the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. The energy that group of people has to come together as a task force to have conversations quarterly, to work in sub task force, to invite other people to the table to this work is key. And one of the ways in which we do that also, in addition to MIW, is through the Truth Seeking, Truth Telling initiative. And so I see the gospel in the ways in which that task force and others who are working in boarding school have reached out to begin teaching about MIW and any boarding schools through the potential memorials that have gone to a variety of synods across ELCA that we will hopefully likely see at the churchwide assembly. And so as I see those folks show up, asking the hard questions so they can answer the hard questions, people who are still on their learning journey, but know that this is the right thing to do and are working through their fear. That's and so for those braves and those warriors out there, both native and non-native, who are being those advocates in that way, whether it be policy, like you folks do there at Witness and Society and our DC office, or those who are who are parishioners, the people in our congregations who are stepping up to do this mighty inside the church, is also pretty exciting, in my opinion.
And I'm going to give Justice the last word. Justice, where have you seen the gospel recently?
Definitely seen it in this last week and probably this morning. I had the opportunity for my schooling that I get to work under a therapist. And as I'm doing my transition exit interviews with a lot of the clients that I get to work with, I've just gotten to see how much they've healed from the first time I got to see them. So I've been with a lot of them for at least 8 months. And so just to see when they first came in, to see them now and just the healing process of it all, I think that was a really big thing for me. And I think that's where I see the gospel in that, is just seeing them heal helped me heal a little bit for them. And I was so sad to see them and say goodbye to them. But yeah, so I think that's where mine is at.
Justice Nichols, Program Coordinator for Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations of the ELCA. Brenda Blackhawk, Director of Communications at Central Lutheran Church, Minneapolis. And Vance Blackfox, Director of Indigenous Ministries and Tribal Relations with the ELCA. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you. It's
Thank
wonderful.
you.
Thanks for having us.
In 2016, the Churchwide Assembly of the ELCA, the denomination's highest legislative body, adopted the repudiation of the doctrine of discovery. The doctrine of discovery originated as a 15th century papal bull laying the legal and religious foundation for colonialism, intolerance, and the annihilation of indigenous people. The ELCA's repudiation of the doctrine of discovery sought to acknowledge and repent from the ways in which the Church has been complicit in the evils of colonialism, which continue to harm tribal governments and individual tribal members today. Since 2016, the ELCA has sought to live out its commitment to stand in solidarity with tribal nations through a number of initiatives, including the Truth and Healing Movement. ELCA presiding Bishop Elizabeth Eaton described the Truth and Healing Movement as being an opportunity for this church to increase our understanding of our colonizing impacts on Indigenous people in the past and in the present. The ELCA's Truth and Healing Movement has joined the larger global Truth and Healing Movement, seeking to shed light on the abuse, violence, and death perpetrated at Indian boarding schools, often at the hands of religious leaders. The ELCA supports legislation to investigate the history of Indian boarding schools, including the role that the Lutheran Church has played in this, as a way to initiate long overdue steps towards healing intergenerational trauma and seeking justice for survivors and their families. The ELCA has also made a commitment to stand in solidarity with organizations working to address the issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Bishop Eaton and the Repudiation Task Force have invited congregations to spend time learning about missing and murdered Indigenous women, as Indigenous women are 2.5 times more likely to experience violent crimes and twice as likely to experience rape or sexual assault as other groups. A number of resources on missing and murdered Indigenous women have been created for congregations and individuals to use and study at elca.org/indigenous. Indigenous people have always been and continue to be part of the Lutheran Church. In an article for Living Lutheran titled Harmonies and Memories, Brenda Blackhawk, one of our guests on today's episode, wrote about the Seward Peninsula Lutheran Conference, a conference of 5 majority Inupiaq congregations on the peninsula, as well as the Alaska Native Lutheran Church of Anchorage. Since the 1940s, the congregations have traditionally gathered for every spring for worship, fellowship, preaching, and singing. This is just one of the many examples of the ways in which the contributions of our Indigenous siblings have and continue to shape the ELCA into a livelier, bolder, and more inclusive and loving church.
Thank you to Vance, Justice, and Brenda for joining us. To learn more about MMIW specifically, head over to elca.org/MMIW, and to learn more about the ELCA's Indigenous Ministries, visit elca.org/indigenous. Links to all of this are in the show notes. This concludes this episode of Here I Pod. If you want to contact us, you can email us over at elcaadvocacypodcast@elca.org or leave us a voicemail at 866-740-3522. Thank you for listening.